No problem.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Now that we have the record button going, thank you. Um, we want to show our value through data, but how do we do that? So there are a lot of hard things about taking something as complex and nuanced as selling and putting hard data and metrics to it. And after all, human behavior is really kind of fluffy, right? It's inconsistent. It's a subjective thing to try to track, let alone tie hard numbers to, like revenue. But, I think that with recent developments in technology, we actually are starting to have data to begin to tell the story about what behaviors are actually influencing revenue. We can look at those top performers and we can say, what are the things that they're doing in their calls? What are the things that they're learning? What are the things that they're completing that are helping them sell more, right? And then we can spread that to everybody else. So we are going to get pretty practical here tonight, but before we do, I want to give kind of the high level overview of like what it is we're trying to do. So, what we're doing with this data is that we want to start with skills, right? Skills that influence revenue, which is ultimately, different behaviors that make up a skill. And I'll go through an example of that in a second. But we want to be able to tie those skills and behaviors to revenue levers. I think that it's a little bit too direct to say, oh, we can tie this enablement program to this number of dollars closed, right? When people talk about the ROI of enablement, I think that that's really hard thing to do unless it's like a super particular thing that you're trying to move the needle on. But generally speaking, the approach that, we're kind of taking here is that we have these skills and behaviors that influence our revenue levers, like number of opportunities, win rate, average deal size, all that good stuff. And those levers are what influence revenue, right? So we're creating this sort of through line between all three of those. Does that make sense, or am I talking nonsense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's take a common skill, right? Just to take a quick example of this. I think that most people would agree that discovery influences revenue in a positive way, right? When we're doing discovery, our win rates are probably higher. We're probably, actually uncovering the things we need to uncover to close that deal. So what we can do is we can look at the competencies or the skills and we can say, okay, what are the behaviors that make someone skilled in that area? Maybe it's that they ask open-ended questions. Maybe it's that they always ask secondary questions on their calls. If you have a CI tool, right, that sort of thing is pretty easy to track. If you don't, there's some hacky ways to do it too that we can talk about later. But I think that, once we understand what those behaviors are, then we can say, okay, what data do we have to measure each skill, whether it's a tracker in Course or Gong or whatever tool form that we fill out. There has to be some sort of metric that is being measured on an ongoing basis to be able to quantify that behavior. And then, of course, I think it's important to tie what revenue lever we're influencing to those behaviors. So if you are wanting to implement this within your org, you might have multiple pillars that look something like this. There might be different ones. This is not going to be the same for everyone, but I wanted to give just a little bit of an example of that. Now, if you're going to foray into this whole tying behaviors and skills to revenue thing, you may want to make a more boring version of the previous slide. And you can go look at this sort of little tracker sheet that I built out as an example, steal it, use it, whatever. But essentially what we're doing is we're saying, what's the competency or the skill? What are the behaviors? What is the exact thing that we're going to do to quantify that? And then what revenue levers it tied to? And that's just going to help you think through that whole sort of journey from the skill that we're directly influencing, that we're enabling on, to how it's moving the needle for revenue. Any questions before we start getting into practical? Eamon.
Yeah. So not boring, actually rather exciting in a lot of ways, because I don't have to often draw the line from left to right. Just that it's an interesting thing to think, how are these things, is it a straight line across? Are they diagonals? Are they forks? Are all the things, right? So this is a question about this table, not as much about your prep. Do you find that there are well accepted ties between this competency and that revenue lever, or do you find that there's a lot of variation from company to company? Like, where on the spectrum do you find that?
So I think that in general, the behaviors that drive revenue, if you go ask, 10 different sales leaders, they're all going to mention the same things, right?
Right.
They're
Yeah.
gonna say it's the people who, and they may not use like enablement terms. They
Yes.
may not say like, oh, they follow a sales methodology or whatever. They're gonna
Right.
be like, oh, they are people, they know how to uncover the stuff in that deal. They ask the right questions.
Right.
Maybe they're like, oh, this person is really good at project management and moving
Right.
that deal through the cycle. So those behave, it's nice because, sometimes it can be kind of hard to draw that line, especially when you're talking to sales leaders who are like, all I really care about is my number.
Yeah.
But when you can kind of level with them and say like, hey, what do you think makes a rep successful, right? And what do we observe our successful reps doing? They can really get on board with a lot of those behaviors, I think. Some of them are going to be a little bit less like exciting, like operational hygiene or things
Sure.
like that,
Yeah.
which are still important. But yeah, I think that generally speaking, like most sales leaders would agree that there are certain things that are pretty standard
Okay.
of skilled reps.
Okay. And
And
certainly
one thing
those
I
are,
would
there's
say,
going to be a good place to launch from any other investigation of behaviors and levers and things like that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
and I
And
think,
I think I cut somebody off.
oh, it's fine. I'm barging in. And one of the things that I think is actually very helpful, and Matt and I have been talking about this over the last couple of weeks, is building this competency map. And this is a step beyond kind of what we were talking about, to include that fourth column on the right. But the idea is you want to have that competency map as a foundation for just about everything that you make decisions on in the future. And it's going to be a living document. It's going to change over time. But the idea of identifying those competencies, defining those competencies, and then giving them a behavior is something that needs to be done early on if you're forming an enablement function for the first time, or you're just joining a company that may not have had one before or may not have had a formal map like that. But what you'll find also is if you have that in place, adding that fourth column in the right, you can make your best guess early on as to how it's going to influence the revenue, and then actually track it and go, oh, well, if they set the next steps, it actually does do deal cycle length. It does affect deal cycle length, but it might be that, discovery and qualification, and this is not necessarily true because I completely believe what Sally has on here. I agree with her 100%, but it might not be win rate. It might be the deal cycle length that it affects the most. And so you want to be able to just track that and keep an eye on that as well. And you could have
Mhm.
even a secondary column there to, if you want to make it even more complicated, but you don't have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. And I think one other thing I would mention about this is that when I am trying to understand what behaviors drive revenue, I first look at who are the sellers who are doing these revenue levers well. And then I work the other way, right? So I go see who has the highest win rate. What behaviors or skills are they exhibiting? And then, okay, who's got the shortest deal cycle lengths? And then we can go work that way. And I do want to shout out Jerry. I don't know if the link that you shared is the one that I'm thinking of, but I literally was making this little chart last week and you had posted, I think probably what you linked here, which is a really like much prettier, much more polished version of what I had already been doing. So I promise I didn't steal it from you.
Hey,
But yours is great.
I encourage people to steal my stuff. That's why I post it.
Awesome. Cool beans. All right. Sweet. So, let's get practical. Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Is there anything
Sally.
else?
You said that comes from a real life example, Jerry. Is that results that you've seen at a company you've worked with?
Yeah, that was when I was actually an internal enablement leader at my last company.
All right. So we're gonna get deeper into the practical here. So when we are like, okay, we know what our competencies and our skills are, we understand what kind of KPIs we're going to try to pull in. Maybe we're starting to do this audit of, what are skilled sellers doing, all that. You're going to start investigating, there's a few practical steps that we can take before we actually start visualizing data. So the first one is to actually take inventory of your data. And what I mean by that is the first thing we got to do is make sure that your data is not a hot pile of garbage. Because if you start doing this, there's a very good chance that you will begin to look at these numbers and you will say, that deal cycle should not be 1,000 days. Right. And so if you start digging into your data and operationally things are just very messy, you can't go start building and, making assumptions based on that data. You got to go clean it up first. It's painful. I had to do that last year when I started in the role I'm in now. But it's definitely necessary. The second thing is to really understand what data you're collecting. List out your tools and figure out what things you're actually tracking. This will give you a sense of like, what things can we actually measure? And depending on what your stack is, that may be a number of different things. And then the last thing I would say is, understand how your different tools are able to export that data. If they can hook directly into Salesforce or your CRM, understand sort of the architecture of like where your data lives and how you might bring it together, because that's going to be really helpful in the next step. Any questions on this before we move on? Pretty straightforward.
By the way, this is an essential one, but it's activities over which enablement usually doesn't have a whole lot of influence. It's usually the ops team that is owning the degree to which emails are logged as activities in Salesforce, and the degree to which calls are actually all recorded by Gong or Chorus or what have you.
Yes.
Those honestly are the two data sources are going to be emails that are sent and received, and calls that are held on the calendar and called and recorded and analyzed by your conversation intelligence.
Yeah,
If you
I love
don't
those
have those
examples.
and they're not working consistently and accurately, you're kind of in a tough spot.
Yeah, definitely. So you may not be able to do all this on your own. is a really good point out of what Jerry just said. So make friends with your RevOps people if you haven't already, because they should be your best friends. I happen to also be RevOps, so I haven't run into too much of this. We also have like no tools, so also makes things a little bit more simple and complicated all at the same time. All right, so I have a couple of practical guides in here that I'm not going to go into in detail, but they'll be in the slides. If you need some help figuring out whether your data is a pile of garbage, this is a good kind of step-by-step checklist to go through. I also have another practical guide on understanding data collection and exporting, some things that you can kind of think through. There's a little handy dandy inventory sheet where you can list out what your different data sources are, does it hook into Salesforce? Can I export it as a CSV? All that good stuff. So that's practical step number 1, right? Any questions on that before we move on to step 2? This is going to go quick so we can get into good stuff. Okay, sweet. So step 2, once we know that we actually have data and it's like decent sort of good data to work with, that's when we go and we build our data source. And what a data source is in this instant is exactly what it sounds like. It is one thing that houses all the data that you are hoping to analyze, visualize, analyze, whatever, right? And this is going to actually feed the dashboards that we're going to create in Looker Studio. You can bring any number of data sources into Looker Studio, and I'll get more into like what Looker is in a second. But some platforms even have direct connections. In our case, we're going to be using Google Sheets as our data source, and we're basically just exporting CSVs from our other tools and putting them into that sheet, because literally every tool you can export a CSV from. At least I haven't run into one yet where you can't. So if anybody has run into one, please feel free to let me know I'm wrong. But yeah, that's our data source. Pretty straightforward. Cool. All right, so there's a few rules that you will be sorry if you do not follow when it comes to creating your data source. Again, these are like pretty in the weeds practical, but they're going to help you, I promise. So the first one is that when you export those reports out of different tools, don't mess with them inside of your data source. Because what happens is if you let's say you change the order of some columns and maybe you do some like fancy formulas or whatever, when you actually go to update that data again, it's going to be really, really hard to just dump in the new CSV and then go. So I don't recommend messing with your data once it's in there. The other really important thing, if you're maybe new to data or you haven't done a lot of correlating data sets with each other yet, is that every report needs to have at least one shared unique identifier. And what I've personally found in my experience is that rep email or AE email or user email is typically the best one to use, because that's going to be universal across platforms, whereas something like a Salesforce ID is not necessarily going to be in your other tools. I also don't like using name, because William might be like William in Salesforce and Bob in your LMS, and like Bob's the coolest in your CMS. I don't know. But unique identifiers, very important. It's okay if your data source is big and ugly, because we're not really going to be looking at it anyway. And my last pro tip is really to automate data syncing wherever possible. You can raise your hand if you're on camera, or put in the chat, who has used the Salesforce connector for Sheets? Of course, Jerry has. Okay. If you haven't used this, it's literally going to change your life if you have Salesforce and Google Suite. If you don't use either of those things, then I can't really help you. But it's pretty cool. And I have a little tutorial to do it, but basically in a few clicks, in 5 minutes, you can dynamically pull in reports from Salesforce to a Google Sheet, and that data will refresh itself on whatever, a series of whatever cadence you set. It is super slick. It makes me very sad that I don't have Salesforce where I'm at right now. Cool. Any questions around any of that?
You're at a place now that doesn't have Salesforce or other tools, and yet you're still collecting data somehow.
Yeah. Shocker, right?
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. It's pretty basic data, but it's there. We do have a CRM. It's fresh sales, in case anybody's ever heard of that one. Yeah, me either. Okay, so
Is it better than HubSpot?
no, not at all. I would
Oh.
take HubSpot 100 times over fresh sales. I love HubSpot. I'm a HubSpot fan. I also love Salesforce. I get along with everybody. As long as I can do the stuff I need to do, I really don't care. But anywho, we could talk about that all day. So when you're putting together that data, initial data source, if you're not sure where to start, I recommend starting with these two reports. One is going to be a deal report that has all of the deals in your CRM from at least the last year, ideally a couple of years worth of data if you can, because that's going to help you see some trends over time. The other thing that I would pull is a rep report or person report or AE report or whatever you want to call it. But that's going to have basic profile information like, who their manager is, what their start date was, all that sort of thing. And hopefully there are also basic revenue performance metrics in there, like maybe what their percent quota attainment was the last quarter, or, there are varying flavors of how or if people are actually putting that in a report in Salesforce, at least from what I've found. So, your mileage may vary on this one, but I've given you in this next slide, again, I won't go into detail on this, but basically there's all the headers that you might want to start with those reports. So if you need to go to your RevOps person and be like, hey, I need a report that has this, right? You've got that list for you there. All right. Any questions before we get into Looker? No? All right, cool beans. So when you put your data source together, it's going to look something like this. You can build your own. You like go pull a CSV right now if you want to play with. But I have an example in here. This is dummy data that ChatGPT gave me. So there's no privacy concerns, nothing. You can, copy it, share, you can post it all over the internet. I don't care. But that is going to be what you can use for your data source if you're wanting to follow along. So if you have not yet set up Looker Studio is essentially a data visualization tool, much like Tableau or Power BI. In my opinion, it's a little bit simpler than those ones, but that may just be personal preference. But you can use Data Studio for free, y'all. Like with your normal Gmail account. You don't even have to have like a workspace account. You can literally go on Looker and sign up and start playing with stuff. And because you have this handy dandy example spreadsheet that I've provided to you, you actually have some data to go play around with in there. So you actually practice before you start, putting your own data in there. So hopefully that is helpful to you all. And I'm going to stop sharing that.
Does it allow you to ingest APIs?
That's a great question. So there's a couple ways you can do it. The first is sometimes there are pre-existing connectors that go directly from a tool to Data Studio. It just depends on, and by the way, it used to be called Data Studio, now it's Looker. So if you hear me say that, it's the same tool. Sometimes there are direct connections. What we do, because we're a nerdy company full of developers, is we take the data from our janky Fresh Sales CRM and we dump it into our central hub, which is our homegrown tool via API. And then we use APIs to send all the stuff from hub, because that has additional data that we care about. So we put everything into hub as sort of our central place, and we use APIs to send all that stuff from hub to BigQuery as a CSV, which is basically like, sending it to just a cloud hosted instance of your data. It's like creating your own little actual database in the cloud. So the answer is yes. But depending on what it is, there's like 1,000 different ways to do it. Cool. Great question, Jerry. Is there anything in particular that you're hoping to connect?
Well, I'm just imagining that there's got to be a way to skip the step you're talking about where you dump everything into a spreadsheet.
Yeah,
Just
there absolutely is.
From tool to Looker.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's going to all depend on where the data is coming from. But the beauty of Looker is that no matter where your data is coming from, you can have as many different data sources in there as you want. So you could have a data source for one report that's like coming from a janky Google sheet. You could have another one that's being fed in through fancy API connections from Salesforce, right? You can bring all those different data sets together. So even if you can't necessarily automate all of them, if you can automate at least some of them, right? You can still have those data sources in Looker. All right, so can y'all see Looker right now?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, perfect. So, you're gonna see me looking this way, so I'm sorry in advance. But when we look at Looker, if you're following along, hopefully you're in there by now. If you need help troubleshooting, just put it in the chat. But when we're in here, the first thing that we actually need to do once we're in Looker Studio is we need to create a data source, because we can't actually visualize data unless we have a source to pull it from, right? Thankfully, we already have a data source, right? Our example thing. So we can go to create data source, and you can see here, Jerry, you're asking about like the different ways to pull stuff in. You can pull in directly from all these different things. A lot of Looker stuff is kind of marketing focused, but there are also a lot of other things in here that your company may already be using. Like BigQuery is actually a pretty common one. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff that can connect to it. MySQL, that's another really popular one. But for now, we're going to use our example database from Google Sheets. So you're going to be adding basically one sheet at a time. And so, we'll start with our AE performance data, hit connect. And then what that's going to do is you're going to see all your fields here. I like to double check and make sure that my numbers or my things that should be numbers are numbers and my things that should be dates are dates and text is text and all that sort of thing. But typically it does a pretty good job of guessing what it's supposed to do. So from here, you either click create report or you can go to reports, and just like we create a data source, we could create a new report. So since we already added that as a data source, you just come in here, add it to our report. Of course, you can like give it a title, all that good stuff. It's going to automatically put this sort of little table in here. You don't have to use it. You can just go in and delete it. The controls are generally, I think, pretty intuitive. But I want to go through an example of sort of the basic, like how to create a table, because this is going to actually help us to understand what it is that we're looking at in these different visualizations. So, yeah, any questions before I go on? All right, cool. So, there we go. I wanted to add one more report before we go on, and that is the deal data report. I think that one's actually a little bit more straightforward to work with. All right, so when we click on a visual here, we can see on the side what data source it's using, our date range dimension. Everything's going to need a date dimension. So whatever report you pull in, make sure that you have some sort of date in there, because otherwise you might run into some issues. When we look at dimension is basically going to be like our x-axis usually. What is the thing that we want to measure? Is it, quota attainment, or is it deal source, or is it, it's going to be like one of those things. When we look at metric, that's going to be how much of that thing. And so you can take these from over here and you can drag them in, say we wanted to see, manager as a dimension. This is just a simple table. So I can pull as many of these over here as I want to. This is actually going to be a really good way to sort of double check when you build a visualization, what is in there. So you can resize this, you can resize the columns, you can sort, filter, or sort within the table. We'll go over filters in a second. But that's like, hey, you just made a table. Congratulations. You're going to be like, Sally, that looks an awful lot like a spreadsheet. It does, because that's basically what it is. But sometimes it's really helpful to have that in there, because when we go and we make different charts, sorry, I can't say my S's. So like, for example, if we use our deal data, let's just do like a simple data source pie chart, right? We go up here to add a chart. You can see all the different kinds of charts you can add. You could also come up here where it says insert, and you could see all the different ones, which is wonderful. And it sort of guessed like what we want to see. Didn't exactly guess right. But right now we're looking at this deal data and our date range dimension. I don't want to use created date because I want to look at maybe just closed deals to see, what deal sources are working. So when we look at our dimension, that's the thing that we want to see, right? And then our metric is going to be how much, right? How much do we want to see? So when we roll over this, now we very quickly have a pie chart, and we can float over. We can see numbers of how many deals for those different sources, all that good stuff. Any questions? I know I'm going a little fast. No?
So
All
in
right,
this
cool.
particular case, what
Yeah.
you're doing when you're building this chart, you want to have in this particular case, just one singular dimension. And
Mhm.
but if say you were doing a line chart or bar chart, you could do several. Is that?
Yes. Yeah. And so Looker will, depending on what kind of chart you create, it will have spaces for those, breakdown dimensions. So let's say I wanted to see deal source by team over time, and I was using a time series, I would be able to break that down by teams. So I'm putting this table in here real quick so that y'all can see why I like to have these tables in here. One of the really important things when you're creating these visuals is to double check your work, right? Make sure when you go calculate something that you kind of cross check with your little handy dandy sort of poser spreadsheet over here. And the way I can do this is I can actually click on, say, like partner. I want to see like, oh, what deals were partner deals? I can click on that, and then it's actually going to filter this other table down. Let's see. I didn't put deal source in here, so that's not super helpful. But you get the point. So if you click on something here, see how it's just got that little piece of the pie highlighted, you'll actually be able to see that over here filtered down, which is helpful for cross-checking. Any questions? Okay. I'm gonna keep on moving then. Just looking at my flow
So
and see.
as she gets started into kind of the next part, I'm curious, from the group here, as you're seeing this being built, how are you imagining, like, oh, I know this is the type of data I have. How are you imagining that you can use this type of information, out of this Looker Studio?
Absolutely, yes, for me. It will be essential for my go-to-market meetings that we have twice a month. Makes it a lot easier than using my Lucid chart and doing a manual process. So this is very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Anybody else already seeing a use case for themselves? I see a lot of heads nodding. Okay. Sally, go ahead, take off.
Perfect. All right. So I added another little bar chart over here. And again, it's just gonna kind of like guess. But let's say that we want to look at, we'll say I had lost from. Oh, here we go. So let's say I want to look at like lost from, and I want to see by industry, maybe what that looks like. This is going to be a little bit small, but you can see since we put in that breakdown dimension, apparently I'm missing some loss from. Oh, you know why this is? Because not all of these deals are actually lost. So not all of them are going to have a loss from field. But I can see, if something was lost from the proposal stage, qualification across different industries, this kind of thing is really helpful for spotting trends and for understanding, what might be causing some of the things that you're seeing within the organization. Now, one of the really handy dandy features that you should definitely get familiar with are the filters sort of per chart. So we can see here that we've got a bunch of these deals that don't have a lost from stage because they aren't lost. But what we can do is we can add a filter and we could say, lost deals, and we're going to include stage. It's equal to, this is all like pretty intuitive, closed lost. Make sure that you're using the same actual name, capitalization, everything that's in your field. Otherwise, this is not gonna look good for you. But see, now that we put that filter on there and we got all the icky stuff out of our chart, we can see, okay, like now I can see a little bit better what it is I'm actually trying to examine. So again, very useful way to look at data, pick things apart, understand it, analyze it, to try to find those different patterns. So any questions before I move on? want to do like, I think one last-ish thing that is going to be super helpful, but I'll move on if anyone's confused.
Debating whether to ask this question now or later, so I'll ask it and you can tell me to punt it down the road.
Okay.
So I come from a very Excel-centered way of thinking. So right now, of course, I'm thinking pivot tables and pivot charts and how I can map those concepts into fiddling around with Looker Studio. Okay, here we go. Okay, so they
There
do
are
exist.
pivot tables for those of you who are pivot table fans.
Good. Okay, thank you.
If that's how you want to see it.
Yeah.
But I think the cool thing about pivot tables, right, is that they help us to understand the relationship between two things, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the other ways that we see that understanding of relationship between two different things, at least in like Salesforce, is calculated fields, right? So
Yeah.
if you look at something like win rate, that's going to be a calculated field that shows your won deals over your won deals plus your lost deals, right? Is a pretty simple example. And that's actually the one that I was going to go over. So
All right, cool.
It's a
Thank
great
you. So both
segue.
ask it now and punt it down the road. Brilliant. Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So we're going to do probably the simplest one in here. That's our little scorecard. And again, it's going to try and guess what we want and probably be wrong. But what we want to do is, let's say that we want to calculate win rate. And again, if you use this calculated field to generate your win rate, you could actually then look at your, your rep report and say, okay, who has the highest win rate? Or we can look at win rate across regions or, whatever different dimensions we want to dissect. So you can add a field here, add calculated field. This is going to look scary. Actually, this one's not too scary. This can look very scary, but essentially what you're doing is you're writing SQL statements. And if you don't know how to code, that's okay, because guess what? ChatGPT is really good at doing this. And you don't have to put anything proprietary into ChatGPT to understand what you need to write in the statement. So, you can literally just ask it, I'm trying to show win rate for my organization. And you describe your fields or whatever. You can say, what's the calculation in Looker Studio that I need to use to show that? And it will spit you back the code that you can copy paste into here. Now, caveat, code is kind of like writing. You can write something several different ways, and they might all be right. Some are righter than others, but for simple stuff like this, ChatGPT has been pretty good for me. It's also thought of things that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of. Like I was calculating the win rate for things last quarter, and ChatGPT was like, oh, that's great, except like in January, this is going to break because it doesn't, like, it's not within the same calendar year as what you're looking back on. So here's the adjustment that you actually need to make to that SQL statement to adjust for that. I was like, who knew? Apparently I didn't. ChatGPT did. So yeah, so if we're doing something like win rate, we're going to do like closed, it'll be something like closed one. I'm not going to do the whole thing right now because you're going to like sit here and watch me fiddle with it, but it basically ends up just being very similar to an Excel formula. And actually I'll bring over the chat where I have that, but any questions? Does that all make sense? Is this useful? Like, I liked Ryan's questions before, like what use cases are floating through your head right now?
Actually, I'm going to mention, would you be okay with sharing that chat into the Zoom chat?
Yeah, if I can figure it out.
You just
I'm trying to
upper-
think. I think you just hit here.
Just
on the
below there a
GPT.
touch, you'll see a little
Yeah.
arrow coming out of a box.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Just below that. That one.
Oh, this
Yeah.
guy's- Okay. Sweet deal. Yeah,
And
this was
then-
one where I was aggregating data into months, but share that one. Other use
And in case
cases?
any of you have not yet had the pleasure, ChatGPT will prevent you from doing things where it's, for example, generated images or you've uploaded attachments. There's all kinds of things it'll just say, nope, can't do that. Too bad, so sad. Hopefully that'll change over time, but it has been useful to be able to do this. And your recipients will not necessarily see changes you've made since you sent that link to them. And again, I'm really hoping that changes. And hopefully if I'm wrong, someone will tell me that has changed already.
My knowledge, that's correct. Use cases. Anybody got one? I'm curious to know what's floating through y'all's mind.
I was just thinking about how many people I work with that don't have good dashboards, period, and are always looking for good tools. And usually it is some like, oh, I'll use a spreadsheet, but I love that you can do joined data sets here and that you can actually do a lot of sophisticated things, even if people don't have a lot of technical training. So this is great.
Yeah. I don't know if this prompt is going to be even close to enough to have ChatGPT spit me out what I want, but if it is, I'll share it. If not, I'll go back and I'll dig up the one that I used most. But there was one thing that you just mentioned, T, that I want to show, and that is that you can blend data in here. So if we go to, and this is going to be a little bit more complicated. I recommend having a little conversation teaching session with ChatGPT on this one. And it's going to kind of depend on how you want to blend your data and what you're blending, but oops, sorry, one. And come up here, go to manage blends, and we can add a blend and we can say, okay, I want to blend, you know, this data, and our unique identifier is going to be not deal owner name, but deal owner email. There we go. So, you know, add whatever sources, metrics, all that good stuff. Dates, we probably want to have like, you know, let's say a close date. I'm not going to like do all of it right now, but we can hit join another table. And then look, we can actually connect another, like this AE performance data table. And again, because we have that unique identifier, oh, it already pulled that in for me. We can blend as many of these as we want. And so this is what allows you then to say, to show like, okay, looking at my call data in say Gong, I can look at the MedPIC scorecard report or whatever and say, what does that MedPIC scorecard look like for my high quota attainment reps versus my not so high quota attainment reps? And those are the kinds of things that are going to help you, again, draw that through line from skill to measurable behavior to revenue lever, right? To revenue. And so like I could do probably like an entire hour on blending data tables, and you can go dig into this all you want. This is like a whole thing in and of itself, but you have the ability, it's free. You like ChatGPTs will literally like show you how to do this stuff. I would not have been able to do 90% stuff in here that I've been doing that's like super complicated. And it's really just incredible what we can do now. So I think that's a good stopping point. And we've got like 1 minute left. So Ryan, if you want to wrap it up, feel free. And I'm happy to stay on, like if y'all have questions or want to dig into anything, I've got time. So
first and foremost, thank you so much for that. I actually learned a ton. Last time I looked at and tried to dig into Looker Studio, I was going ass backwards into a lot of things. And I didn't even think about going back to ChatGPT. I think this is maybe even before ChatGPT was really all that popular, but I didn't think about going back into ChatGPT to learn from it. I do that for so many other things. And I didn't think, yeah, I should ask about how to use a tool. So that makes tons of sense. I think, I'll take that away from me for sure. What questions is that, before we close out, because I want to respect everybody's time, but what questions are at top of mind right now that we might be able to answer for you in the next minute or so?
Yep.
Nima?
Yeah. If you want to share the studio output with somebody else and you don't want them to damage it, is there a kid zone kind of thing you can a fence?
That's a great
Absolutely.
question.
Yes.
Okay.
So the short answer is yes, it works exactly like a Google Doc where you can share a view only view, and
Right.
it's like literally same share button. The other cool
Yes.
thing is that you can actually have it automatically email that report or that dashboard to whoever on a regular cadence.
Okay.
Your sales managers get emailed an
Right.
onboarding progress report once a week
Yeah.
for their reps, right? Stuff like that.
Okay. Cool. And again, since I'm coming from an Excel perspective, I know how to lock down some cells and allow other cells to be fiddled with. Is the same idea built into Looker Studio where the user you designate can say, I want to fiddle with this variable, and you prevent them from doing actual damage. It's just an input cell.
Yeah, so there's actually drop-down filters that you can add.
Okay.
And they don't, I don't think that you can control them necessarily per user.
Mhm.
You could have a particular view that is only shared with that user.
Right.
But yes, you could say, let them adjust the date range or only view things for
Right.
their team.
Right. Okay. 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 Good.
Those are
Any
dynamic.
controls are better than none.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Humans can't trust them.
Mm.
No. No.
Very good.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mine isn't a question, it's just a statement. I kudos
please.
to y'all for putting this together and for everyone who showed up. That I'm very confident that an enablement leader in the next 5 years who doesn't understand data and how to use it to produce insights is not going to be very good at his or her job.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're 100% correct there, Jerry, for sure. Last thing I'll say to you guys is thanks again so much for showing up. I like putting this on for everybody. And Sally, I can't appreciate you enough for taking the opportunity to talk to everybody. We'll be doing this again next month. And I will make sure everybody's aware of what's happening. And if you have any questions of me, or I'm assuming anybody on this call would be happy to take questions, but if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have a topic that is just, burning a hole in your brain and you want to explore that either next month or the coming months, just let me know. We'll put it together.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
I'll stay on
Thank
for a
you,
minute.
Ryan.
Thank
If
you.
anybody
Sally.
needs anything. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Sally. This
creating
is
this
really
community.
helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah,
Take care.
this was great.
Sally, I do have a question for you if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I had a much yuckier